Forgiveness, a gentle unburdening. Welcome to Mindfulness, a space where we explore the art of living with awareness, compassion, and presence. Forgiveness is not about pretending the hurt never happened. It's not erasing history or saying what was done was okay. Instead, it's the quiet, courageous choice to release the heavy chains of resentment we carry inside. As Thich Nhat Hanh often taught, holding on to anger is like holding a hot coal. It burns only you. Letting it go is not for the other person's comfort, but for your own liberation. I remember a friend in California telling me how she had spent years avoiding family gatherings because of a fight with her brother. The details of the disagreement had blurred over time, but the knot in her stomach remained sharp and vivid. One day, after listening to a guided meditation by Jack Kornfield, one of America's most beloved meditation teachers, she decided to try something new. She sat quietly, breathing, picturing her brother, and whispered inside herself, "I release you. I release me." She told me she cried for hours, not because she suddenly loved him again, but because the weight she'd been dragging around finally loosened. Forgiveness is deeply personal, but it's also universal. Neuroscience now shows that forgiving, truly letting go, changes our brain chemistry, lowering stress hormones and boosting the neural pathways for empathy. In other words, it's not just spiritual talk, it's biology helping us heal. Teachers like Sharon Salzberg and Pema Chodron have echoed this truth. When we forgive, we step back into the present moment, no longer trapped in the emotional echo of the past. For me, the first real lesson in forgiveness came from Thich Nhat Hanh's story about the boat people fleeing Vietnam. Pirates attacked their vessel, and many suffered greatly. Yet instead of feeding the cycle of hatred, he urged them to see the humanity, however buried, in their attackers. Not to excuse the actions, but to recognize that those who cause harm often carry deep suffering themselves. This kind of radical compassion isn't easy, but it's the kind that frees the heart. In daily life, forgiveness can be small. Letting go of the irritation toward the driver who cut you off. Releasing the annoyance toward your partner who forgot something important. Or it can be enormous. Finding the courage to forgive someone who truly betrayed you. Both are acts of reclaiming your freedom. And there's another layer we often forget. Forgiving ourselves. We speak harshly to ourselves in ways we'd never speak to a friend. Yet, as the Buddha taught, you can search the whole world and not find anyone more deserving of your love and compassion than yourself. Self-forgiveness is not self-indulgence. It's the soil in which growth can happen. Without it, we keep replaying our mistakes, unable to move forward. Forgiveness is not a one-time event. It's a practice, like meditation, that we return to over and over. Some days we might feel lighter. Other days the resentment might sneak back in. That's okay. As Jon Kabat-Zinn, the father of mindfulness-based stress reduction, reminds us, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. The practice is simply noticing, breathing, and choosing again to let go. In the end, forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about remembering without the poison. It's about looking at the wound and saying, yes, it happened, and I choose not to let it define me. That choice, repeated gently over time, can turn pain into wisdom and bitterness into peace. When you allow forgiveness into your heart, for others and for yourself, you create space. Space for love, for joy, for presence. And in that space, you might just discover that freedom has been waiting for you all along. The hidden cost of holding on. When we refuse to forgive, we often think we're protecting ourselves. We imagine our anger as a shield, guarding us from future harm. But in truth, that shield is heavy, rusted, and pressing against our own chest. It doesn't block pain. It keeps us locked inside it. Thich Nhat Hanh once said, when you plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you do not blame the lettuce. You look for reasons. Maybe it needs more water, more sunlight, or better soil. Holding grudges is like blaming the lettuce over and over. It doesn't change the past. It just keeps the heart dry and starved of what it needs to grow. Modern psychology has a term for the toll this takes: chronic stress load. Research from Stanford University shows that unresolved anger elevates cortisol and adrenaline, keeping the body in a constant state of alert. This fight or flight state is meant to protect us for minutes, not months or years. Over time, it exhausts the immune system, disrupts sleep, and can even affect memory. I once attended a retreat with Tara Brach, a meditation teacher whose work blends Buddhist wisdom and Western psychology. She told a story about a woman who came to her with severe insomnia. For years, this woman had been replaying a painful breakup every night before bed, as if punishing herself for trusting the wrong person. Tara guided her in a simple loving-kindness practice, breathing in and silently saying, "May I be free from this suffering." Breathing out, "May I find peace." It didn't fix everything overnight, but over weeks, the nightly storms in her mind began to quiet. Holding on to resentment is like drinking salt water when we're thirsty. It feels like we're doing something, but it only deepens our thirst for relief. The Buddha spoke of anger as a burning torch that scorches the hand that holds it. We might think we're aiming that flame at the person who wronged us, but most of the heat never leaves our own skin. Sometimes people fear forgiveness because they believe it means losing their boundaries. But as meditation teacher Jack Kornfield often reminds his students, forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. It's not inviting someone to hurt you again. It's simply releasing the fantasy that your pain will punish them into becoming who you wanted them to be. You can forgive and still keep your distance. You can release bitterness and still stand firm in your values. Forgiveness is, in many ways, a gift to our future self. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack for miles, filled with rocks representing every hurt, betrayal, and disappointment. Each rock has a story. Each feels justified. But the longer you carry them, the less you can enjoy the scenery, the less energy you have to take the next step. One day, you might realize you're allowed to set the bag down. Not because the rocks have disappeared, but because you've decided your journey is worth walking freely. Sharon Salzberg tells her students that the mind clings to the familiar, even if the familiar is painful. That's why letting go is an act of courage. It asks us to step into the unknown, a place where we are no longer defined by our wounds. And in that space, healing becomes possible. Forgiveness does not erase accountability. It does not excuse harm. It simply says, I will not let your actions be the prison I live in. The moment you choose to let go, you reclaim your time, your energy, and your peace. In the quiet that follows, something beautiful happens. You begin to hear the subtle voice beneath the anger, the voice of your own longing for freedom. And that is where the journey truly begins. Forgiving yourself, the hardest door to open. If forgiving others feels like climbing a mountain, forgiving yourself can feel like moving the mountain entirely. Many of us carry regrets the way some people carry old photographs, tucked away, hidden, but always ready to surface when we least expect it. Thich Nhat Hanh once shared that self-compassion is like tending to a wounded child. When we make mistakes, the natural reaction is to criticize ourselves harshly, as if punishment will prevent it from happening again. But a wounded child does not heal from scolding. They heal from gentle care, from being seen and held with tenderness. In my own journey, I've met countless people who found it easier to forgive a stranger than to forgive themselves. A man I met at a meditation retreat in Massachusetts told me about a car accident he caused years earlier. No one died, but the guilt stayed like a shadow over his life. He had tried therapy, distractions, even moving to a new city, but nothing silenced the voice inside whispering, "You should have been more careful." It wasn't until he attended a mindfulness program led by Jon Kabat-Zinn that something shifted. In a guided body scan meditation, he was invited to place a hand over his heart and repeat silently, "This, too, is part of being human." The tears came slowly, then in waves. For the first time, he saw his younger self not as a villain, but as a man in pain who had done the best he could in that moment. The Buddha taught that all beings make mistakes because all beings are subject to ignorance and imperfection. We are conditioned by our upbringing, our fears, our hopes, our blind spots. When we see this clearly, self-forgiveness becomes an act of wisdom, recognizing that our past self was operating with the tools they had at the time. American meditation teacher Tara Brach often speaks of radical acceptance, the willingness to acknowledge our flaws, our failures, and our suffering without turning away. It's not about liking what happened. It's about creating the inner conditions where transformation becomes possible. If we're busy hating ourselves, we can't grow. Science also backs this up. Studies from the University of Miami show that self-forgiveness is strongly linked to lower levels of depression and anxiety. When we release self-condemnation, our mind is more open to learning and adapting, rather than repeating the same patterns out of shame. One practice I often recommend, drawn from both Buddhist tradition and Western mindfulness, is the mirror meditation. Stand before a mirror, look into your own eyes, and imagine speaking to a dear friend who has suffered. You might say, "I know you've struggled. I know you've made mistakes, and I'm still here for you." At first, it can feel awkward, even impossible. But over time, the message begins to land, like drops of water softening stone. Jack Cornfield tells a story of a prisoner he worked with through a meditation program. The man had committed a violent crime in his youth and had spent decades behind bars. Through years of mindfulness and loving-kindness practice, he began to forgive himself, not to erase responsibility, but to stop living in an endless replay of his worst moment. He said, "I realized I could spend the rest of my life punishing myself, or I could spend it making whatever good I can from here on out." That shift transformed not only his life, but also the lives of those he mentored inside the prison. Forgiving yourself is not an overnight achievement. Some wounds are deep and require steady, gentle tending. But each act of self-kindness, each time you choose understanding over condemnation, is a small key turning in that locked door. Eventually, the door opens, and you find yourself standing in a place you didn't know you could reach. A place where you can meet your own reflection without flinching. And in that moment, you understand what Thich Nhat Hanh meant when he said, "To be beautiful means to be yourself." You don't need to be accepted by others. You need to accept yourself. That acceptance is where true freedom begins. When forgiveness feels impossible, there are hurts so deep, betrayals so sharp, that the very idea of forgiveness can feel like a betrayal of ourselves. Sometimes we hear people talk about letting go, and we want to shout, "You don't understand what they did." And maybe they don't. Maybe only you know the depth of that wound. Thich Nhat Hanh often taught that forgiveness is never forced. It blooms when the soil is ready. Trying to forgive before we've tended to our grief is like planting seeds in frozen ground. In those moments, the kindest thing we can do is give ourselves time, space, and the permission to feel everything without judgment. I once attended a retreat with Sharon Salzberg, where a woman shared her story of losing a loved one to a violent act. She said she had no interest in forgiving the person responsible. The pain was still too raw. Sharon didn't tell her to rush the process. Instead, she offered a simple practice. Start with not hating yourself for not being ready. That small shift, removing self-judgment, was the first crack in a wall she thought was permanent. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It's a path you walk, sometimes slowly, sometimes with pauses. And there will be days when you take a few steps back. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. The Buddha himself acknowledged that the heart moves at its own pace toward understanding. In America, meditation teacher Jack Cornfield often speaks of the wisdom of the heart, the idea that compassion can coexist with accountability. You can want justice and still work toward inner peace. You can set firm boundaries and still release the bitterness that corrodes your own spirit. Neuroscience suggests that our brain's threat system becomes overactive when we hold on to rage, especially after deep trauma. The amygdala, our brain's alarm bell, stays switched on, keeping us in a state of hypervigilance. This is why even years later, certain sounds, smells, or words can reopen the wound. Forgiveness, when it comes, helps calm that system, allowing our body to finally stand down. At a retreat center in Vermont, I met a man named David who had survived abuse in his childhood. For decades, he carried a vow: I will never forgive. But in his 50s, after years of therapy and mindfulness practice, he realized that holding on was costing him more than it was protecting him. Forgiveness for him didn't mean reconciling with his abuser or excusing what happened. It meant reclaiming the parts of himself that had been frozen in anger for decades. He told me, I didn't forgive for them. I forgave so I could live. If you're in a place where forgiveness feels out of reach, it's okay. Sometimes the work begins not with forgiving, but with simply wishing ourselves well, or with sending compassion to the parts of us still hurting. Tara Brach calls this softening around the pain, allowing ourselves to hold the wound gently instead of gripping it like a weapon. The truth is, forgiveness is not always immediate, and it's not always complete. Sometimes it's a lifetime's work. But every time you choose to take even a single step toward releasing the poison, whether that step is a breath, a prayer, or a moment of quiet understanding, you are already walking the path. And as Thich Nhat Hanh reminded his students, when you understand, you cannot help but love. Understanding may take time. Love may take time. But both are seeds that, when tended, can one day grow even in the hardest soil. The practice of letting go. Forgiveness isn't an idea we simply agree with. It's a skill we learn, a muscle we strengthen through practice. Just as a pianist builds fluidity by returning to the keys every day, the heart learns to release by returning to small, intentional acts of letting go. Thich Nhat Hanh often spoke of mindful breathing as the doorway to freedom. He would say, breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I release. These simple words are more than poetic. They're a direct instruction for forgiveness. Each exhale becomes an opportunity to set down what no longer serves us, even if just for a moment. Over time, those moments become our new default. One of the most practical tools comes from American meditation teacher Sharon Salzberg, loving kindness meditation. Begin by sitting quietly and repeating phrases like, may I be happy, may I be healthy, may I be safe, may I live with ease. Once these words feel natural, extend them towards someone you love, then someone neutral, and eventually, someone who has hurt you. It's not about pretending you feel love for them immediately. It's about planting seeds of goodwill in a heart that's been hardened by pain. At a retreat in California, Jon Kabat-Zinn guided us through what he called forgiveness body scans. As we slowly moved our attention through the body, we noticed where tension lived, in the jaw, the chest, the belly. He asked us to imagine those places as clenched fists and to let them soften, finger by finger. It was a physical metaphor for the emotional unclenching that forgiveness requires. Science supports these practices. Studies from Harvard Medical School show that mindfulness reduces activity in the brain's default mode network, the region linked to rumination and replaying painful memories. In other words, meditation helps us stop reliving the story of our hurt over and over, giving the mind a chance to rest. But letting go doesn't always happen in stillness. Sometimes it comes through movement, walking meditation, yoga, even mindful running. I once met a woman at a Pema Chodron workshop who said she forgave her ex-husband 1 mile at a time while training for a marathon. Each step became a small release, a quiet affirmation. I'm moving forward. It's important to remember that letting go is not about erasing memory. As Jack Kornfield reminds his students, the heart can forgive while the mind remembers. Memory can remain as wisdom, as a boundary, as a reminder of our resilience. The difference is that the memory no longer controls us. When we practice letting go, we discover that forgiveness is less about the other person and more about the relationship we have with ourselves. It's about deciding that our peace matters more than our need to be right. It's about understanding that we can't rewrite the past, but we can shape how it lives in us now. The more we release, the more space we create. Space for joy, for creativity, for connection. Forgiveness becomes less of a dramatic event and more of a daily hygiene for the heart. Just as we wash our bodies, we wash our minds of the residue of old hurts, so that we can meet each new moment with clarity and openness. And perhaps most beautifully, forgiveness doesn't have to start big. It can begin with the smallest of irritations. Letting go of a stranger's rude comment, releasing the frustration of a missed appointment. Each small act strengthens the muscle, preparing us for the deeper releases when life calls for them. In the end, the practice of letting go is the art of living light. As Thich Nhat Hanh said, if you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. And that peace is not just a feeling, it's the freedom to truly live. Forgiveness in relationships. Forgiveness takes on a different weight when it happens within the bonds of family, friendship, or love. In these spaces, we are often most vulnerable and where the deepest hurts can occur. The very people we trust the most have the greatest power to wound us. Yet they also hold the greatest potential for mutual healing. Thich Nhat Hanh often compared relationships to a garden. If we only focus on the weeds, the mistakes, the arguments, the disappointments, we will miss the flowers blooming quietly alongside them. Forgiveness in relationships is not pretending the weeds aren't there. It's choosing to tend to the whole garden with patience, not just the parts that frustrate us. In American mindfulness teachings, relationship repair is often framed as a practice of deep listening. At a workshop with Jon Kabat-Zinn, he told a story about sitting down with his teenage son during a particularly tense time in their relationship. Instead of lecturing or defending himself, Jon simply listened, without interrupting, without planning his response. He described it as listening with the ear of the heart. That space allowed both of them to lower their defenses, and from there, forgiveness could naturally emerge. Sharon Salzberg teaches that one of the greatest obstacles in relationships is our attachment to the story we tell about the other person. We replay their mistakes in our minds until they become the whole of who we believe they are. Forgiveness asks us to soften this narrative, to remember that, just like us, they are more than their worst moments. Science supports what these teachers have long known. A study at the University of North Carolina found that couples who actively practiced forgiveness through both verbal acknowledgement and emotional letting go experienced lower stress, better conflict resolution, and deeper intimacy. The researchers noted that forgiveness acted like a reset button, allowing couples to approach future conflicts with less baggage. I once met a couple at a retreat with Jack Cornfield who had been married for over 40 years. When asked their secret, the wife smiled and said, "We've learned to forgive each other for being human every single day." It wasn't a grand, one-time act of forgiveness, but a continuous practice of letting go of the small slights, misunderstandings, and disappointments that inevitably arise in a shared life. Of course, forgiveness doesn't mean tolerating harm or erasing boundaries. Pema Chodron reminds us that compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Forgiving someone in a relationship may sometimes mean creating distance, setting new boundaries, or even ending the relationship entirely. The forgiveness is for our own freedom. The boundaries are for our safety and dignity. One helpful exercise for relationships comes from Tara Brach, the RAIN practice. Recognize, allow, investigate, nurture. When a loved one hurts you, first recognize what you're feeling without judgment. Allow the emotions to be present rather than pushing them away. Investigate gently where the hurt lives in your body and what it's connected to in your story. And finally, nurture yourself with kindness as you would a dear friend in pain. This softens the ground for forgiveness to grow naturally. Forgiveness in relationships is less about winning or losing and more about remembering why the connection matters in the first place. It's the willingness to say, this pain is real, but so is our shared humanity. And when both people participate in that process, forgiveness can become the bridge that turns hurt into deeper understanding and misunderstanding into renewed love. In the end, forgiveness in relationships isn't just about healing a moment. It's about sustaining a bond. As Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, to love without knowing how to love wounds the person we love. Forgiveness, practiced sincerely, is one of the ways we learn how to truly love. When forgiveness becomes part of who we are, life begins to feel lighter, clearer, and more spacious. The moments that once triggered us lose their grip. The stories that once defined us fade into the background. And in their place, we find a quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Thich Nhat Hanh taught that true freedom is not found in the absence of obstacles, but in the way we meet them. When we forgive, we no longer carry the burden of being the jailer of our own heart. We stop rehearsing the pain and start rehearsing peace. The energy we once spent replaying old wounds is freed to create, to connect, and to live. I once heard John Kabat-Zinn say at a public talk in Boston, forgiveness isn't about the other person doing anything differently. It's about you deciding you're done with suffering twice. Once in the moment it happened, and again, every time you relive it. That truth lands deep. The past doesn't need to change for us to be free today. Pema Chodron calls this unconditional friendliness, turning toward ourselves and others with the kind of compassion that doesn't require everything to be fixed first. This friendliness doesn't mean agreeing with harmful actions or erasing accountability. It means refusing to let resentment be the lens through which we see the world. Science echoes these teachings. Research from the Mayo Clinic shows that people who regularly practice forgiveness have lower blood pressure, reduced anxiety, stronger immune systems, and even longer life expectancy. The body knows what the heart has always known. Carrying bitterness is heavy work, and setting it down is a relief. Living with forgiveness doesn't make life perfect. We will still be hurt, and we will still make mistakes. But the difference is, we'll know how to meet those moments with a steady breath and an open heart. We'll know that peace is not something we wait for others to give us. It's something we choose again and again. And perhaps the greatest gift of forgiveness is that it ripples outward. When we forgive, we model for others what is possible. Our relationships shift. Our communities soften. The world becomes, in small but meaningful ways, a kinder place. As Thich Nhat Hanh said, peace in oneself, peace in the world. Forgiveness is one of the surest paths to that peace. It is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. A story in which we are no longer defined by what has been done to us, but by how we choose to respond. If you've journeyed with me through these reflections, I invite you to take a deep breath and feel the space in your heart right now. Whatever you're holding, know that you have the power to release it. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to take the next step forward. Lighter, freer, more alive. This is the spirit of mindfulness, not just a practice, but a way of living that invites us to meet each moment with awareness, compassion, and the courage to let go. Thank you for being here. May you find the peace you deserve, and may that peace touch everyone you meet.